It's time to down tools for a bit. Welcome to the ToolShed, the influential podcast for anyone and everyone involved in the building industry. Here's your host, Mick Hawes.
Hey folks, welcome to another episode of the ToolShed Podcast. As you're aware, what we're doing on this podcast as often as we can is giving you tools, platforms, ideas, philosophies, as much education as we can around building a more successful, more enjoyable building business. Now, over the period of time that I've been working with builders, there has been some legal issues, not between me and the builders, of course, but between builders and their clients, builders and their staff, on all of that sort of stuff. And sometimes it's very difficult to get the right picture, the right advice as to what we should do, how we should handle things. So in this episode, I'm going to be speaking with Nicole Davidson, and Nicole is a lawyer, does a lot of mediation and so forth, and we're just going to have a conversation about what we need to look out for, the mistakes we make so we can avoid it, and sort of have a bit more of a happier life in our building business with our team and with our clients and prospects. So, Nicole, thanks for joining us. First question is, I just want a little bit of the backstory, like how did you get involved? I just find this really interesting. Even my story as to why I'm doing what I'm doing now, I don't believe how I got here. So I find that sometimes people have really interesting stories as to how they ended up doing what they do and why you're passionate about it. So start at the start and tell us how you got here.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mick. I'll give you the relatively short version because it does take a while to tell this story. But you said I was a lawyer. I like to call myself a former lawyer in that I am qualified as a lawyer. And that was one of the things I did early on in my career. I did law commerce at Melbourne Uni, never really wanted to be a lawyer, but it was easier to qualify as a lawyer than an accountant. So I did that. But then I worked in commercial insolvency and investment banking. So all up, that was sort of about 10 years. And I sort of realized that what I was doing there just wasn't making me feel happy, wasn't giving me that sort of nice buzz at the end of the day. And I wanted to be working more, helping people. So I went into learning and development, where I started working on, what were the sort of non-technical skills that people needed to be successful in the workplace. And from there, I started getting into the training room, delivering training on a whole bunch of sort of management and communication skills, until I fell into a role that was just teaching negotiation and conflict resolution. And that's where I found my passion. So I was with them for about 2 years training, and then I thought I need to be doing, not just teaching. So I set up my business, and now I sort of continue to teach the skills of effective negotiation and conflict resolution. But I also work with people and put those skills into practice on a regular basis as a negotiation and conflict advisor and as a commercial mediator. So that's the quick version.
Yeah, it was great. Very slick. So I don't want to put you out of business, but I do want to ask some questions that I suppose are focused a little bit more on the preventative side of things.
Yeah.
As an example, we've had some of our members over our journey have some issues with some of their team members doing the wrong thing. Not performing in a way that was professional. Really, I guess the best way I can describe it is doing the wrong thing. And then when it came time to sort of put a full stop on it and part ways with that person, a couple of the situations that I've observed, it became very, very difficult to get rid of the person. It also seemed quite unreasonable and quite unfair that the person who had done completely the wrong thing was still afforded additional payments and additional rights and all of that sort of stuff. And yes, the law is the law, but it seemed to be quite unfair. So I don't know whether you can help us with some some advice, some direction as to how we should really be setting up our relationships, let's say with our team members first, to make sure that when this does happen and we need to have that difficult conversation, our guys have got all of their ducks in a row. So what do you see in that space?
Yeah, great question. And I do a little bit of work in the employment space. And look, I think the first thing I'd say is that setting the right expectations is absolutely critical. And, I see things that have gone wrong, and I often look at them to say, well, why did this end up here? Why wasn't it something that they could solve for themselves? So having really clear standards and expectations set of people is probably the first step. Now, from a legal perspective with employees, getting the right advice about the documentation and bringing people on and having those job descriptions and things that will help you is such a worthwhile investment. I know one of the problems with lawyers is that they're really expensive. And so often we sort of cut corners by not getting legal advice because we don't want to spend that money. But actually making that investment can be really helpful. But that's from the legal perspective. From the practical perspective, as I said, those expectations and being really clear about what the standards are and stepping in and having a conversation the minute there's a breach of that standard. Sometimes because giving feedback is not something people tend to love doing, or sometimes they don't do it very well. Often that feedback isn't given. And so somebody's going along doing the same thing over and over, thinking it's fine because no one said anything. And then it kind of blows up down the track. Now, that's going to lead to a much bigger conflict than if you can actually address things up front. So I think, having those expectations, managing those and dealing with any departures from the set standards early is going to be the really key thing about this, so that you've got a chance of giving the person an opportunity to fix the problem. And if they don't, you've done all the right things, which are going to protect you if there is a claim. And, once again, unfortunately, because of the cost of defending claims, employers often do have to pay out money to someone just to get something settled, because it's cheaper to do that than to go through and actually defend against a claim that's not valid. And, unfortunately, that's just one of the really negative things of our legal system.
Can we talk about mediation for a moment? And I guess starting off with the difference between, I guess, full-on legal proceedings and mediation. What is the purpose of mediation?
Yeah, great question. And I think, a lot of people don't really understand it, or if they have seen it, they've seen it maybe in a family law context. So mediation is really where the mediator's job is to facilitate the negotiations between the two parties. So what they're doing, so say if it was between a building business and one of their staff members, the mediation would start by giving each of those people the opportunity to explain what they think the conflict is about, why it's got to where it is, and what's important. And what we try and do is actually work through that to come up with a solution that is acceptable to both parties. And that's not to say that the law doesn't play a part, because if you've got a really strong legal case, then you're going to be less likely to be flexible, because if you can't resolve it at mediation and it goes to court, you're going to be in a stronger position. But it does take into account the cost and the delays of going to court. So the biggest difference between mediation and going to court or litigation is that nobody's forced to take on any particular outcome. It's all voluntary, but it's about trying to be commercial and efficient. And so that's where the mediator will help you with your negotiations.
So what's it like being a mediator? Does everybody love you at the end or not? What's your experience?
Yeah, do you know what? I think the interesting thing about that, look, I like to think that I'm quite friendly as a mediator, and somebody described me as a right uppercut and a velvet glove. So I can be tough, but I do it in a nice way. So generally people are relatively happy at the end of the process. And what I find really interesting is even the parties I actually send out feedback at the end of a mediation process to say, well, how happy were you with the outcome? How happy were you with the process? And even though sometimes people aren't, excited about the outcome, most people are actually very happy to go through that process and have the ability to be heard and have the ability to actually say their piece. Because if you go to court, you've got a really limited opportunity to say what's important, because it's a very rigid process. So most people will actually find the process quite pleasant, and it's certainly a lot less intimidating than going to court, where you've got to swear on the Bible and give evidence and do all of those sorts of things. It's a pretty relaxed process when you go through mediation.
Yeah. What's the best way to prepare for mediation? I know that I laugh because it wasn't funny at the time, but it's funny now. It was just a small dispute with a real estate company many years ago, and one of my friends is a lawyer up in Sydney. I'm down in Hobart, and he's sort of saying, this is what you need to do and prepare and what have you. But the main thing is stay calm. I'm going, yeah. And you can probably tell what's going to happen in the rest of the story. It lasted about 2 minutes, the calm, because it was such a frustrating process, and the people on the other side of the table, like a guy came in who had absolutely nothing to do with the events that led up to it, but it was the owner of the organisation, and he came in full bore attacking me and all of that sort of stuff, and my calmness didn't last for
Look, and that's actually part of the process of what the mediator should be doing. So when I have the opportunity, and not everybody wants to do this, but I will generally meet with both sides ahead of the mediation to have a one-on-one conversation. And a big part of that is actually helping them be prepared for the mediation. And that's sort of, it's not rocket science, but it's about reminding them that they're going to hear things that they disagree with, and that they're going to hear things that they think are lies. So I do let people know that they are going to have the chance to get their point across. And because it's not my role to decide who's right or wrong, which would be the role of a judge if it went to court, they can kind of just, relax a little bit, knowing that, they'll get their say, but ultimately, it's more about looking at the future and getting a resolution. So to prepare for the mediation, there's a couple of things that are really important. One is actually being really clear about what's important to you. Things like, how important is the money in the grand scheme of things compared to getting it resolved quickly, compared to the need to be right, compared to impacts on other relationships or impact throughout the organisation. So you really need to understand all of those dynamics of what this means to you. You need to start thinking about what might be important to the other side as well, because if you can't put proposals on the table that are going to meet their objectives in some way or another, then the chances of getting to an outcome in mediation are pretty limited.
Yeah.
The other thing that is really important is thinking about what happens if it doesn't resolve. And this is where, unfortunately, what I have to say to people at the beginning of a mediation is, it's not necessarily about coming into a mediation to get the best outcome, but sometimes it's about getting the least worst outcome. And I say that because if you're in a negotiation, if you're in a situation that's going to court, even if you win, you're probably likely to lose in the bigger picture. Your costs, any money you get back might be eaten up in costs. You're wasting hours and hours of your life on this dispute, and you're probably losing a lot of sleep over the time that it takes to get to a resolution. So what we're trying to do in the mediation is get you to something that's better than that. And so, as I said, it's often not about getting an outcome that makes you jump up and down, but I talk about, think about what can you live with? What can you actually think about, in 10 weeks or 10 months or 10 years, you'll have been able to put this behind you. And so that's really part of the preparation, is thinking about that. The other thing where I see people making mistakes in mediation is that they expect the other side to take their word for it. A classic is, when I'm doing mediations about someone owes you money and they go, but I just don't have it, I'm broke. You can sue me, but there'll be nothing there for you to get. And all they're doing is expecting someone to believe them. So if you're going to make a claim of any kind in the mediation, if you can get some sort of objective evidence or support from somebody that's not just you that confirms that, then that's going to be more powerful. So I've had mediations where somebody's gone, well, I've got no money, and therefore you won't get anything. And they've actually completed a statutory declaration about their financial position, which is a little bit more persuasive than you just saying you're broke, sending copies of your bank statements. It might be that, I'm trying to think of another scenario. It might be that a client, you're saying to a client that if they want to fix something, it's going to be, X thousand dollars to rectify a problem that's come up. And, the more you've got detailed calculations about that or something to support that, the more powerful it will be. So actually thinking about, what can I give the other person so that they know that I'm not just trying to pull the wool over their eyes, but what I'm saying is true, is another important part of the preparation.
Yeah. What I really liked about what you just said then was your approach to speaking with the people individually before you go in, so you can expect or know what to expect what you get in there, because that didn't happen in the case that I described before. Like, we lobbed in there. I wasn't aware of really what the purpose or the powers that mediation had, and that was sort of mentioned to us as we got in there. Like, the very first thing the mediator said was, I don't have the power to make a decision. It's not a legal decision. All I'm here to do is mediate between the two of you and get the best outcome possible that we can all agree on to prevent you from going to court. And it's like,
Yeah.
Hey, I'm Mick Hawes from Builders Business Black Belt, and I hope you're enjoying this episode of the ToolShed Podcast. I've got something super exciting I want to share with you. We've got a place that's got a whole bunch more free resources to help you with your building business. In fact, there's a whole other podcast that gives you specific training that will help you get more free time, more profit, and more enjoyment from your building business. And it's called, funnily enough, the ToolShed. It's free to join, and it's full of other success-focused builders. And I invite you to join us in the ToolShed, where you can ask me questions and get guidance and support from other successful builders. Just click the link in the description to join, and I'll see you in there. I hope you enjoy the rest of this podcast. What would have been a handy bit of information to know before we went in there?
I think it depends. Picking the right mediator can be really important as well. So, what style does your mediator have, to the extent that you can make a choice? So, if it's a private mediation, you should be able to pick whichever mediator that you want, subject to the other party agreeing. Sometimes if you're going through government-sponsored mediation programs, you don't get a choice and you've just got whoever's there on the day.
Yeah.
But looking for someone who really is a proactive mediator. Some mediators are current lawyers who bring a much more litigious view to mediation, and they don't really focus on the emotional aspects of the dispute as much as people who are perhaps more career-based mediators, and that's their sole sort of way of doing things.
Yeah. And so just to clarify, the legal decision-making opportunity in mediation is kind of zero. It really is just a chat with somebody who really does know the legal perspective,
what happens,
or what's the story?
No, so if you've got a successful mediation, what you'll be looking for is, at the end of that, you will sign a document, which generally it's called a terms of settlement or a deed of settlement, or a settlement agreement. So what you'll actually get is, at the end of the mediation, if you've come to an agreement, you'll both sign a contract that says this is what we've been agreed. And it might say that if one party doesn't hold up their end of the bargain, the other one can take this contract to court to go and get a judgment for the thing that was agreed. So it's not as enforceable as a court judgment, but it still is a binding contract that the parties will enter. But the difference between litigation and this is that you only sign a contract to do something that you agree to do. You're not forced into a solution that you don't like.
Yeah. What are you allowed, as far as preparation for mediation, what are you allowed to do to bring with? Are you allowed to have representation And I'm just thinking from the perspective of somebody who probably doesn't have a high level of self-confidence and gets very nervous speaking to people or that sort of stuff. If you don't have somebody who knows what they're doing and has that sort of confidence and ability to put a few sentences together, you could probably be in a bit of trouble. So what are you and what aren't you allowed to have in mediation?
So it depends a little bit on where the mediation or how the mediations come about as to who you might bring. So it is a flexible process. So depending on where you're doing your mediation, there may be real flexibility in that. So if you're in VCAT, you may be encouraged not to have representation, but you'd need to check. If I'm doing private mediations, I'll talk to the parties about who they want to have present. And as long as the other party is comfortable with who's in the room, for me, it's all about everyone being comfortable. The more comfortable they are, the better they are. And I would rather have someone in a mediation with a support person, whether that's a lawyer or whether it's a friend or whether it's someone else from the business. If they're going to be better placed to be feeling comfortable and a bit more relaxed in the process, then they're going to be able to make sensible decisions. I can't expect someone to make a decision if they are so stressed and anxious that they're actually not able to think properly. And when we are stressed and anxious, our brains literally start to shut down. So if somebody comes and wants to bring a support person with me, my first reaction is generally, yes, that's fine. And I just need to check that with the other side. But I think having someone there, and from time to time, I actually act as a support person in mediations for people as well. So it is worthwhile having someone on your side.
Yeah. So let's talk about Nicole Davidson negotiation.com.au/services. So like you are a mediator, so you perform that, but I believe that you also have training and you also have coaching, I'm assuming, to prepare people for the negotiation. Is it for just mediation, or do you teach people negotiation techniques for business?
Negotiation for business, and the skills are the same. So whether you're negotiating in a mediation or whether you are just doing a negotiation on yourself, the skills are all the same. So my programs I have a negotiation program, which I flex in terms of how long people have available as to how much we cover, but it introduces people to the foundational process of negotiation. It shows them how to use that quite strategically, because we all negotiate all the time, but often we're just sort of doing it by chance a little bit. So I build that skill in. I also look at helping people with difficult conversations or conflict conversations where we add the emotional aspect in and look at how do we deal with those really emotional people. And if you're a builder and you're dealing with a homeowner who's really stressed and anxious, they're probably going to be quite emotional. How do you deal with the person who comes and yells at you? How do you deal with the person who, when you say there's a problem, they just sort of sit down quietly and don't say anything, but you know that they're probably going to come back at some point down the track and get really upset about this. So I can help people build those skills ahead of time so that they've got them when they need them. When you've got an acute situation that's arisen, there's a conflict that's popped up and you just need a bit of a bit of hand holding and guidance through that, you can also call me, and that's where I do the coaching and support work. Okay. So it might be that you've got a situation come up and you go, I think I know what I'm doing, but I'm not sure. So I can do a half-hour call service where we just talk that through, and then you might just go, you know what, I'm all good now. Sometimes I'll work with people in a much more detailed way where I'll either, it might be coming to a mediation or coming to a negotiation with them. I might take on the lead of the speaking, or I might just be there, as the support person going through. I also recently introduced a new process, which is for people who have disputes that don't justify the cost of going to court, but they need to get them resolved. So I did this, my first one was with a $4,000 dispute, and both parties, it was a property owner and a demolition company. And there was a dispute about the final bill and some work that hadn't been done, whether it was included in the quote or not. We started with a mediation process, but we'd agreed up front, and they'd signed a contract to say that if we couldn't get to an agreement in the mediation, it was going to be up to me to make that decision. and they would sign a document with whatever I'd decided. They'd sign a contract to that term. So I call that my sort of little judge Judy process, which I think is a really helpful thing for disputes that really can't justify the cost of going to court.
Yeah. So there's the coaching side of things, that if you're needing some support, guidance, what have you, for something that's going on, we've got that covered. You did mention the training, but I want to unpack that a little bit from the perspective that particularly builders, people listening to this are builders. And I guess having had lots of relationships with lots of builders over the years doing what I do, a lot of them don't have really great negotiation skills. Therefore, it hits the fan a little more often through projects than it would need to. And I think by having some negotiation skills, it could avoid a whole raft of issues down the track. Like it's a really good prevention strategy skill set to have. So can you sort of talk us through what people might learn going through the training, what sort of skills they would learn, and what sort of situations that would be handy to have for?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, one of my recent training clients in the last couple of years was a large chain of home builders.
Yeah.
And what we did with them was they were particularly looking at their site supervisors who were struggling to know how to deal with problems that were arising on site. So they were having to deal with both problems with subcontractors and staff, but also problems with customers. And so what we did was we actually took them through and we give them a process to follow. So there's a structure behind every negotiation. There's what we call the 7 elements model. And there's 7 different things that are going on in every negotiation. So what I do is I work with groups to teach them that so they can understand and recognize these 7 different components of the negotiation. And so when a problem comes up, taking a step back, the first thing that helps them do is actually plan more strategically before they even get into the negotiation.
Yeah.
And they say that about 80% of your success in a negotiation comes from the quality of your planning. And it's an area where people will often shortcut. So if you actually start doing some more planning before you get into those discussions, you'll almost guaranteed to increase the success of your outcomes. But once problems do arise in the negotiation, and maybe it's a client threatening to litigate, maybe it's somebody who's pressuring you to give them discounts because they're a repeat customer, maybe it's a staff person who is just refusing to budge on something that they want. What we can do is we can break that down and look at, well, which of the 7 elements are being impacted here, and that will give us some strategies to use to know what the best approaches might be to move forward from that process. So the way that I work with people, it's a program that's literally replicates in a lot of ways the way that negotiation is trained at the Harvard program on negotiation. It's very experiential. So we give them theory in a fun way. We get people negotiating, we get them some feedback, and they really get to see it in action. And I adapt all of the courses for who's in the room. So we basically do the same program, but if I've got a bunch of builders in the room, I'll use examples that are related to building. If I've got a bunch of bankers, I'll use financial examples. So I try to bring it to life for everybody so that they can actually really think about how they apply that. And I also remind people that they can practice their negotiation skills at home and with friends as well, because what we use for negotiating in business is exactly the same skill set that we use negotiating in the rest of our lives as well. And I think that actually can make a really big difference. I actually had somebody say to me after they'd done the course once, and I bumped into them about 6 months later, and she said, "Oh, I'm so glad I did your course. It saved my marriage." So without making any promises, there's some real benefits to learning this stuff.
Yeah. Somebody interested in getting your help with some coaching or perhaps the training, what's the best way? Where do they reach out to you? How does it look? How does it work? Run us through it.
Fantastic. So the coaching, the easiest way to come into that is through what I call my negotiation GP service. So just as if if you're losing sleep because you've got a recurring headache or stomach ache or a sore leg or something, you'll go to the GP to figure out what to do. If you're losing sleep over a negotiation, come to the negotiation GP and I can help you. So you can book a consultation for that through my website, negotiationgp.com. And that's probably the best way to start. If it works out to be a much bigger assignment, then that initial consultation gets credited against any other fees. With the training, at this point, I don't have public training sessions available. So it's really an idea of, give me a call if you're interested in training. If you've got a group of people, I can have a chat about that. Or potentially, we could look at doing a group session across your network, Mick, if there's enough interest in that.
Perfect. So, fascinating conversation. I love doing this podcast when I'm learning all of this new stuff. It's great stuff, and it's good to know, I think, from a builder's perspective, that there are people out there that can support them. I guess it depends on which side of the fence you're on. I've been a customer of tradespeople and builders in the past, and I've been working with builders, exclusively, if you like, for 10 years. And I don't know, from my perspective, it seems to be a little bit skewed against them. Everyone thinks that they're ripping them off and they're too expensive and all of that sort of stuff. And there's low levels of trust and what have you. And it just seems to be very, very difficult to be a builder in this day and age. And any support we can give them to prepare better, because most of the builders that we work with, in fact, all of the builders that we work with, but most of the builders I know really want to help their clients and really want to give their clients a great experience and great value and all that sort of stuff. And I think it's just, as you said right at the start, not setting expectations properly in the beginning that causes most of these issues.
Absolutely. And I think, having been a client of a couple of builders in the last couple of years, I think that the issues that arose in our projects definitely came from, I think one of the problems is that there's this curse of knowledge. As a builder, you know all of the stuff that you are talking about and you've got an idea of what's going on in your head, but you're dealing with a customer who probably doesn't have the same level of knowledge. And yet the problem is to actually give them that level of knowledge and to invest the time in that. It's a really slow process. So we take shortcuts in terms of setting up the engagements to be practical, but those same shortcuts are the ones that might lead to issues. And what I tend to find, and certainly if I think about, I did 2 projects. I did a renovation on a couple of old heritage rooms, and then I did a renovation on a bathroom. And one of the issues that came up in the heritage room is we had fireplaces and we were replacing the hearthstones, and we just left it to the builder to measure the hearthstones and to do all of that. And he measured them, we sent it off, we had sort of old tiles that were there in the initial one, and we got a beautiful slab of polished bluestone cut to fit. And when we put the mantelpiece around, it actually was wider than the hearthstone. And we're like, what on earth happened? And his immediate response was to blame us because we hadn't done the measuring. And our immediate response was to kind of think about blaming him because he had done the measuring and he should have done it properly. Because what had happened, of course, nobody had actually noticed that the mantelpiece was bigger than the existing hearthstone stuff. And, I think that's the biggest problem is on a complex project like a building project, there are so many variables that not everything can be thought of in advance, and that's generally where the problems arise. So if you can actually have a more collaborative process to work out, well, it's really actually neither of our faults, but what the hell are we going to do about it? You're going to get a much more productive outcome. And so I think that remembering that it's not always someone's fault that these things happen, but the blame game really can get in the way and escalate conflict.
Certainly can. It can get out of control before you know it. Nicole, thank you very much for putting time aside to come and talk to us on the podcast. It's been absolutely fascinating. So thanks for being on the podcast.
Absolute pleasure, Mick. Thanks for having me.
That's it for this episode of the ToolShed Podcast. I hope that this got you thinking just about how you're setting expectations with both your team and dotting all of the I's and crossing the T's, making sure you're prepared, documenting everything, hopefully so it will never be needed. Same with the clients, but at least we know now that there are the people like Nicole out there that you can reach out to get some advice. And I would suggest to you that you reach out and have a conversation and just inquire about the potential training and the skills that you could learn, because as I said, I think it's a great skill to have as a preventative approach for your business, learning the skills and the psychology behind negotiation to prevent those problems from happening, so you never end up in mediation or any sort of legal challenges. So jump on the website. We're going to put the link in the description, and do the GP scenario that Nicole was talking about. Reach out, have a conversation, and see how Nicole might be able to help you with some of those areas in your business. So that's it for this podcast. We'll be back with another episode of the ToolShed Podcast before you know it. I'm Mick Hawes, Builder's Business Black Belt. That is all. Bye for now.
You've been listening to the ToolShed. If this podcast struck a chord with you, make sure you spread the word by sharing it with your mates in the building industry. We love your help to make the building industry better for everyone involved.